Picture a government that looked at a problem eating its farms alive and decided the answer was to import a killer, not a poison, not a fence, a living, breathing, hunting animal, shipped across the world in wooden crates, bred by the thousand, and set loose across an entire country on purpose. The men who signed off on it believed they were saving their farms. They believed nature would balance itself if they just gave it the right weapon. Scientists stood up in front of them and told them exactly what would happen. They told them the weapon would ignore the target and turn on something far more precious. They were laughed out of the room, and within a few short years, the thing those scientists warned about came true in the worst way imaginable. The predator barely touched the pest it was brought in to destroy. Instead, it went hunting the one creature that had no way to defend itself. It went hunting the bird that an entire nation had chosen as its own symbol. This is the story of how New Zealand released a predator to stop rabbits, and how that predator started eating the national bird instead. Before we go any further, if you find stories like this one fascinating, the kind of history that most people never hear about, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel right now. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it means the next story lands right in your feed. Now let us go back to the beginning, to a country that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. To understand the disaster, you first have to understand the rabbit. Because before the predators, there was the rabbit, and the rabbit alone was nearly enough to bankrupt a young colony. European settlers began bringing rabbits to New Zealand in the 1830s and 40s. The reasons were simple and, at the time, sensible. Rabbits were food. Rabbits were sport. A gentleman settler wanted the countryside to feel like the England he had left behind, with familiar game to hunt and familiar meat on the table. So they let them go, a few here, a few there, in a land that had never seen anything like them. New Zealand had spent tens of millions of years in near total isolation. It had split off from the ancient supercontinent long before most modern mammals ever evolved. As a result, the islands had almost no native land mammals at all, apart from a couple of species of bat. There were no foxes, no cats, no weasels, no ground predators of any kind stalking through the undergrowth. The whole ecosystem had grown up without them. For a rabbit, this was paradise. There was nothing to hunt it. The winters were mild, the grass was endless, and rabbits, as anyone who has ever kept them knows, do one thing better than almost any animal on Earth. They multiply. A single pair can produce dozens of offspring in a year, and those offspring breed within months of being born. So they bred, and bred, and bred. What started as a handful of animals for the dinner table became a tide. By the 1870s, in parts of the South Island especially, rabbits had reached what people at the time could only describe as plague proportions. Hillsides moved. Pasture that had fed thousands of sheep was stripped down to bare dirt. Farmers watched the grass that was the entire foundation of their livelihood vanish into a churning gray and brown mass of fur. This was not a nuisance. This was economic ruin. New Zealand in that era ran on wool and on sheep, and sheep needed grass. When the rabbits took the grass, the sheep starved. And when the sheep starved, whole stations went under. Land values collapsed in the worst-hit districts. Men who had poured everything they had into a run of country watched it turn worthless because it now belonged to the rabbits. People tried everything. They shot rabbits. They trapped rabbits. They dug out warrens and gassed them and poisoned them and set dogs on them. They built fences hundreds of kilometers long to try to hold the tide back. They organized great drives, pushing thousands of animals into nets and pits, and none of it was enough. The rabbits always came back, faster than any man could kill them. Out of that desperation came an idea. And it was an idea that sounded on the surface almost elegant. In Britain, rabbits did not run wild in the same way. And the reason, people said, was simple. In Britain, rabbits had enemies: stoats, weasels, ferrets, small, lean, ferocious hunters of the mustelid family, animals that lived to slip into a burrow and kill whatever they found there. Back home, these predators kept the rabbit in check. That was the natural order. That was the balance. So the thinking went like this. New Zealand had a rabbit problem because New Zealand was missing a piece of nature. The islands had the prey but not the predator. The balance had been broken, and if man had broken it by bringing the rabbit, then surely man could fix it by bringing the rabbit's natural enemy. Import the hunters, release them into the hills, and let nature do the rest. It would cost far less than fences and poison. It would be self-sustaining. The predators would breed on their own and keep working forever, for free. This was the great appeal, and you can understand why a struggling farmer loved it. Every other method cost money and labor without end. This one promised to solve itself. The pastoralists, the big sheep farming interests, began pushing hard for it. They lobbied the government, they wrote to the newspapers, they set up their own operations to make it happen. It also fit perfectly with the spirit of the age. This was the era of what were called acclimatization societies, organizations formed across the British colonies with the express goal of moving useful and familiar species around the globe and settling them into new lands. To the Victorian mind, the world was a garden to be arranged, and if a place seemed to be missing something, the obvious answer was to go and fetch it from somewhere else. These societies had already flooded New Zealand with foreign birds, fish, deer, and countless other creatures, most released with barely a thought for what they might do. Bringing in a predator to hunt a pest was simply the next logical step in a project people already believed in completely. They were not acting against the science of their day. They were acting on it, on a confident, sweeping idea that human beings could and should redesign whole ecosystems to suit themselves. And here we reach the moment where the story turns, because not everyone agreed. In fact, some of the most knowledgeable people in the country begged them to stop. Among the loudest voices of warning was a man named Walter Buller, one of New Zealand's foremost ornithologists, a scholar who had spent his life studying the island's extraordinary native birds. He and others like him, in New Zealand and back in Britain, looked at this plan and saw catastrophe coming. Their argument was based on something the farmers were ignoring. These predators were not fussy specialists that only ate rabbits. They were opportunists. They would eat whatever was easiest to catch. And in New Zealand, the easiest thing to catch was not the rabbit at all. Remember what New Zealand's birds were. They had evolved for millions of years with no ground predators, and evolution does not waste energy on defenses against threats that do not exist. So these birds had, over the ages, simply let go of the abilities they no longer needed. Many of them stopped flying, or lost the power of flight almost entirely. They nested on the ground, or in low holes, out in the open, because nothing had ever come along to raid a nest. They were slow, they were trusting. Some of them, when a predator approached, would freeze or even come closer out of curiosity, because they had no instinct that said, run. The scientists understood that if you released a hunting animal into that world, it would not have to work hard for rabbits sheltered deep in guarded burrows. It would find whole populations of defenseless birds sitting in the open, unable to fly, unable to fight, unable to even recognize the danger. It would be the difference between hunting and simply gathering. The warnings were detailed, they were specific, and they were completely ignored. There was a bitter public debate in the 1880s, but the farming lobby had the money, the political pressure, and the desperation of a colony being eaten alive. The government sided with the farms. Some argued the mustelids would not even dent the rabbits, others feared for their poultry and their lambs. But the voices worrying about native birds were treated as sentimental, as standing in the way of survival. The decision was made. The predators would come. And so began one of the most deliberate acts of ecological engineering in the history of the world. Getting the animals to New Zealand was itself a serious undertaking. Shipping small, delicate, wild predators halfway around the planet in the age of sail and early steam was difficult and expensive. Many died on the voyage. A trapper in England named Walter Allbones became known for developing the methods to catch stoats and weasels in the British countryside and keep them alive long enough to survive the journey south. This was a trade. There was money in supplying killers to a desperate colony. Once the animals arrived, or once breeding stock was established, the operation scaled up with astonishing speed. Ferrets were the easiest to work with. Being partly domesticated already, They could be bred in large numbers, and breeding stations sprang up to churn them out. In the province of Marlborough, single stations were producing and releasing something on the order of 800 ferrets every year through the 1880s. The numbers recorded by official bodies are staggering. In the year 1888, one rabbit board liberated around 1,000 stoats and weasels, another 1,000 ferrets, and 400 cats into the countryside in a single push. The next year it released hundreds more of each. In the year 1890, over 7,000 ferrets were let loose across Otago alone. And these were only the recorded, official releases. Countless more animals were bred and freed privately by individual farmers, so many that the authorities admitted they could not even count them. It is worth pausing on the cats, because they often get forgotten in this story. Domestic cats were released deliberately too, alongside the mustelids, as just one more weapon in the war on the rabbit. Nobody at the time seems to have stopped to wonder what a wild population of cats would do to a country full of flightless birds. Today, feral cats are counted among the most destructive predators in New Zealand, right alongside the stoat. Every animal added to the mix to fix one problem became a new problem of its own, and every one of them found the native birds long before it found the rabbits. There is a grim irony buried in the rabbit trade as well. Even as the colony poured effort into breeding predators, it was also building an entire industry around the rabbit itself. Rabbit skins and frozen rabbit meat became genuine exports, shipped out by the millions. So, at the same time that farmers were begging for predators to wipe the rabbit out, other hands were making a living off the very same animal. The rabbit was pest and product at once, and this tangle of interests helped ensure that it would never actually be eliminated, no matter how many killers were set loose to chase it. Think about what that means. This was not an accident. This was not a few animals escaping from a ship. This was a nation, over more than a decade, systematically breeding tens of thousands of predators and releasing them into every corner of its own wild country, on purpose, with government blessing. Now, if you are still with me, and I hope you are, take 1 second to leave a comment below with the name of the country you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. It really does help the channel reach more people. Then stay with me, because now we get to what actually happened once those animals hit the ground. At first, there was hope. The predators were out there. Surely the rabbits would fall. But the mustelids, and the stoats above all, did exactly what the scientists had predicted. They took one look at the rabbit, a fast animal that lived in a defended burrow and knew how to run, and then they looked at everything else on the islands, and they made the obvious choice. The stoat is a remarkable animal, and that is precisely the problem. It is small, roughly the length of your forearm, lean and low to the ground. It is a superb climber, able to go straight up a tree trunk to reach a nest that a fox could never touch. It is a strong swimmer, able to cross rivers and even reach offshore islands under its own power. It is relentless, driven by a metabolism so fast that it must kill and eat constantly just to stay alive. And it has a habit that makes it uniquely destructive. When a stoat gets into a place full of easy prey, it does not just kill what it needs, it keeps killing. It will slaughter far more than it can eat, storing the surplus. Driven by an instinct that in New Zealand had no natural limit. Turn that animal loose in a forest full of flightless, ground-nesting, defenseless birds, and you have not restored a balance. You have lit a fire. The people who released them saw it almost immediately, if they cared to look. There are contemporary accounts of what happened in the very first hours after liberation. In one report, a stoat set free on a farm traveled miles within a single day and killed 7 ducks. In another, a farm manager described watching the animals the moment they were released and seeing one make straight for a young native bird before it had gone more than a few steps. These were not slow, creeping declines that took decades to notice. From the first day, anyone paying attention could see that the newcomers had no interest in playing the tidy role assigned to them. They had been handed a country where killing was almost effortless, and they went to work at once. The warnings the scientists had given were not vindicated years later in some distant statistic. They were confirmed within hours, in blood, on the very ground where the crates were opened. The collapse was fast, Within about 6 years of the mustelid spreading, people were already noticing drastic declines in native bird populations. Places that had once rung with birdsong began to fall silent. Species that had covered the country started retreating, shrinking back into the few pockets the predators had not yet reached. Naturalists who had documented thriving populations returned to find them gutted, and here is the bitter heart of the whole affair. The stoats and the ferrets and the weasels never solved the rabbit problem. Not really. The rabbits, safe in their burrows, breeding faster than anything could keep up with, largely shrugged off the new predators and carried on. The islands ended up with the worst of both worlds. They still had the rabbits, and now they had an army of killers loose among the birds as well. The men who imported the predators had paid the highest possible price for nothing. The weasels, at least, mostly failed to establish. Back in Europe, their staple diet had been small rodents like voles and lemmings, which New Zealand did not have, so their numbers stayed low. The ferrets did better, and spread across the open farmland. But it was the stoat that became the true nightmare. The stoat took to the forests, the very heartland of New Zealand's native wildlife, and there it settled in to hunt. Now we come to the bird at the center of this story. The bird that would become the nation's symbol, and the bird the stoats would hunt hardest of all. The kiwi. There is no other bird quite like the kiwi. It is roughly the size of a chicken, flightless, nocturnal, with shaggy feathers of an almost fur-like texture and long cat-like whiskers. It has nostrils at the very tip of its long beak, unusual among birds, which it uses to sniff out worms in the soil in the dark. It even has marrow in its leg bones, a feature you would expect in a mammal, not a bird. In almost every way, the kiwi is a bird that has spent millions of years becoming something other than what a bird usually is, because in a land with no ground predators, it never needed the usual bird defenses. And that is exactly what doomed it. The kiwi cannot fly away. Its wings are tiny, useless, stubs buried in its feathers. It has no proper breastbone, which means it has almost no protection over its chest and organs. It nests on the ground, in burrows and hollow logs. Its chicks hatch and are left largely to fend for themselves, tiny, slow, and utterly vulnerable. To a stoat, a young kiwi is not a challenge. It is a meal waiting to be taken. The figures are almost impossible to believe. In areas where stoats are active and nothing is done to control them, an estimated 95% of kiwi chicks that hatch never live long enough to breed, 95 out of every 100. On much of the mainland, stoats alone are responsible for roughly half of all kiwi chick deaths. A young kiwi is at risk from stoats until it grows to around 1 kilogram in weight, at which point it is finally big enough to fight one off. But most of them never get the chance to grow that far. They are killed while they are small and helpless, often within their first weeks of life. Sit with that for a moment. New Zealanders chose the kiwi as their national emblem. They put it on their coins, their military badges, their brand. They call themselves Kiwis. It is the animal that represents the entire country to the world, and a predator that the country itself deliberately imported has been quietly wiping out that very bird, generation after generation, one helpless chick at a time. The kiwi was not the only victim, not by a long way. The arrival of the stoat helped push several unique New Zealand birds off the edge entirely. Species like the bush wren, the laughing owl, and a native thrush known as the piopio declined and vanished, gone forever, with stoats named among the culprits. Others were driven to the very brink and survive today only under the most intensive human protection. The takahe, a large flightless bird once thought extinct. The kakapo, a heavy, flightless, ground-dwelling parrot, one of the rarest birds on Earth. The mohua, the kaka, the waio, all of them hammered by an animal that should never have been there. Stoats are so effective that they can kill birds many times their own size. A stoat weighing a few hundred grams will take on a takahe of several kilograms, or a nesting kakapo, killing the adult and the eggs and the chicks in a single raid on a hole in a tree. Nothing in the New Zealand bush was built to survive this. Every defense the predator had, the birds lacked. Every weakness the birds had, the predator was built to exploit. There was another twist that made it worse, and it involves the forest itself. Every few years, New Zealand's native beech trees undergo something called a mast, dropping enormous quantities of seed all at once, far more than usual. That seed feeds an explosion in the rat and mouse population, and rats and mice are food for stoats. So a mast triggers a chain reaction. The rodents boom, the stoats boom on the back of them, and then when the seed runs out and the rodents crash, the huge surplus population of stoats turns hungry on the native birds. These mast years become killing seasons, and without intervention they can devastate a bird population that had spent a decade slowly recovering. Across the whole country, the toll is staggering. It has been estimated that introduced predators kill something on the order of 25 million native birds in New Zealand every single year. Not over a decade. Every year. A slow, grinding, relentless bleed of the wildlife that makes those islands unlike anywhere else on Earth. And now for perhaps the most maddening detail of all. For decades, the very animals doing this damage were protected by law. Because they had been imported at such cost and effort to fight the rabbits, stoats, weasels, and ferrets were legally shielded. It was, for a long time, against the rules to freely kill the animals that were eating the national bird. That legal protection was not lifted until the year 1936, more than half a century after the first releases, by which time the damage had long been done and the predators were established across the land. The country had spent 50 years defending the killers of its own wildlife. This is the point where the story could simply end in tragedy. A young nation, desperate and proud, refused to listen to its own scientists and paid for it with the near destruction of the creatures it loved most. But that is not where New Zealand chose to leave it, because in the decades that followed, something remarkable happened. The country decided to fight back. The realization came slowly, then all at once. As the true scale of the loss became undeniable, New Zealand began to see its native wildlife not as scenery, but as something worth saving at almost any cost. Conservation went from a fringe concern to a national mission. Offshore islands were cleared of predators one by one, painstakingly, until they became arks where the rarest birds could be moved and finally breed in safety. Fenced sanctuaries were built on the mainland, ringed with special barriers designed to keep every last stoat and rat out. And then came the boldest declaration of all. In the year 2016, the New Zealand government announced a goal so ambitious that much of the world thought it impossible. The country would aim to become entirely predator-free by the year 2050, not reduced, not managed, free. The plan set its sights on the total elimination from the whole of New Zealand of the worst introduced predators, the stoats, the ferrets, the weasels, the possums, and several kinds of rat. An entire nation setting out to hunt down and remove, to the last animal, the very creatures its ancestors had so carefully brought in. The scale of the effort is enormous. Communities across the country have taken up trapping, ordinary people running lines of traps through their local bush on weekends. One project on the south coast of the capital, Wellington, set thousands of traps across tens of thousands of acres to beat the stoats back, and in the year 2022, it celebrated releasing kiwi into hills where the birds had not been seen for a century and a half. In places where predators are controlled hard enough, the results are undeniable. On the Coromandel, for instance, the local kiwi population has been doubling roughly every decade thanks to sustained trapping. The birds were never the problem. Given even a fighting chance, they come back. None of this is cheap, and none of it is simple. The predator control effort costs well over $100 million a year. Scientists and engineers have poured effort into new tools, self-resetting traps that can kill many times before a human needs to visit them, and increasingly clever technology to detect and target the animals. Researchers are experimenting with sensors, with cameras, even with forms of artificial intelligence to recognize a stoat and act on it automatically, because the one thing that has always beaten human trappers is the sheer tirelessness of the enemy. A stoat never stops. It breeds fast, it travels far, and a single female slipping through a gap in a trapping network can reseed an entire valley within a season. That is what makes the stoat such a formidable target. It is not just deadly to birds. It is astonishingly hard to catch. It is wary of new objects. It ranges over huge distances. It swims to islands that conservationists had declared safe. Clearing one from a patch of bush is difficult. Clearing every last one from an entire country of mountains, rainforests, farmland, and coastline is a task on a scale humanity has almost never attempted against any animal. There are hard ethical debates woven through all of it too. Arguments about the methods used, about aerial poisons and kill traps, and what truly counts as humane. Arguments that genuinely divide people who all want the same birds to survive. Some see the poisons as a necessary evil, the only tool that can reach the vast, roadless interior. Others see cruelty in it, and push for traps and technology instead. What almost nobody in New Zealand disputes anymore is the goal itself. After more than a century of watching the birds disappear, the will to save them has become something close to a shared national value. Whether the dream can truly be finished by 2050, whether the last stoat can ever really be hunted down, remains an open and hotly contested question. But the fact that a country is seriously trying at all is remarkable. But step back and look at the whole shape of this story, because there is a lesson in it that reaches far beyond one country and one bird. New Zealand's predator disaster is one of the clearest examples in all of history of human hubris toward the natural world. It was not done out of malice. The men who released the stoats genuinely believed they were being clever, that they had understood nature well enough to reach in and adjust it, to add the missing piece and set everything right. They believed in a simple, tidy idea of balance, where every problem had a matching solution you could import in a crate, and they were so certain of it that they overrode the people who actually knew the birds, who told them plainly and correctly what would happen. The result was the opposite of what they intended in almost every respect. The rabbits they wanted to destroy largely survived. The birds they never meant to touch were devastated. The predators they imported to serve a purpose became a permanent plague that their descendants would spend fortunes and generations trying to undo. One decision, made in desperation and pride, reshaped the wildlife of an entire nation for over a century. And the bill is still being paid today, one trap and one saved chick at a time. There is something almost unbearable in the image at the center of it. A country that loved a small, strange, flightless bird so much that it made that bird its own name and its own symbol. And that same country, decades earlier, with its own hands, importing and breeding and releasing the exact animal most perfectly designed to kill it. The kiwi did nothing wrong. It simply existed the way millions of years of a predator-free world had shaped it, and it nearly paid for a human mistake with its entire existence. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I really do want to hear what you think in the comments. When we look back at a decision like this one, releasing a predator that scientists specifically warned would destroy the native wildlife, is it fair to judge those farmers and officials as reckless? Or were they simply desperate people doing the best they could with what they believed at the time? And more than that, do you think a nation can ever truly undo a mistake on this scale? Or are some doors, once opened, impossible to fully close again? Tell me where you stand. If this story taught you something you did not know, or made you see a familiar little bird in a completely different light, then do subscribe and stick around, because there are far more stories like this one waiting. History is full of moments where humanity was absolutely certain it had outsmarted nature, right up until nature proved otherwise. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.